Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar, where we will be discussing the realities of nearshoring. Nearshoring is often positioned as a way for companies to optimize their operations and build supply chain resiliency. While companies are seeking to benefit from faster delivery times, reduced transportation costs, and increased flexibility, they are also faced with unique obstacles that come along with moving operations across continents. A lot to cover. So we would like to thank you for being here today for this important update. And with that, let's get started. My name is Brace Kane. I'm a marketing analyst within Global Freight Forwarding Marketing at UPS Supply Chain Solutions. And I'm excited to be joined by an excellent group of speakers today. It is my pleasure to introduce our subject matter experts, Alex Jennings, Mexico Director of Carrier Sales with Coyote, Tim Wing, Director of Global Customs Brokerage Growth within Supply Chain Solutions. Milton Magos was slated as a speaker as well, but due to scheduling conflicts, he is unable to join us. Before we go into the agenda, here are a few quick administrative updates. The meeting is being recorded and will be made available to everyone who registered for this particular webinar. We encourage participation and would like to ensure we answer your questions. Please make use of the Q&A function at any point during the webinar at the bottom of the screen. We will try our best to answer your questions during the webinar through the Q&A function, or if necessary, we will contact you privately after the webinar. So make sure you use that little button down at the bottom, Q&A, and put your questions in there. For legal purposes, I am going to read the following message verbatim, and then we'll be ready to start today's great content. This presentation is for informational purposes only. It does not constitute legal advice. Please consult with your legal counsel for such advice. Do not rely on this information without performing your own research. This morning, we will hear from our speakers surrounding nearshoring realities. Now let's take a quick look at the agenda. What is nearshoring? We're going to talk about the background, the current situation, the benefits and challenges, along with customer trends. And then we're going to go into brokerage and trade compliance considerations, our best options, USMCA overview, Section 321, forced labor. Then we're going to look into some outlook for nearshoring and review some of the key takeaways from the sessions that we have with Alex and Tim. And then don't forget about that Q&A feature that we have. Put the questions down at the bottom so that they can answer your questions, hopefully live that we have, and if not, we can answer them afterwards. With that, I would like to turn it over to our Mexico Director, Alex Jennings, to begin the briefing on nearshoring. Alex?
Thank you, Brace, and thank you everybody for your attendance today. Kick this off with some background on nearshoring, and quite simply put, what is nearshoring? Nearshoring is the practice of relocating operations from overseas closer to home. This could be your production, your manufacturing, fulfillment, even labor in some instances. Most notably, where we're seeing this happening today, and for our webinar specifically, we're seeing this occur in Mexico as well as in Canada. When we look at specifically where in Mexico, we're talking about border cities such as Tijuana, Mexicali, Juarez, as well as central Mexico. Major cities with manufacturing infrastructure today, such as Monterrey, Guadalajara, and the Bajío region. These are also taking place in industrial parks that have already been established and are continuing to be built with investments as well. And really, why is this occurring? Really, we're looking to take advantage of the various benefits, including cost and operational efficiencies that we're experiencing by seeing manufacturing shift from overseas closer to home in Mexico and Canada. And really, when has it started? It's not a new trend. We have seen this going back a couple of years now, but it definitely has accelerated the growth. This growth has been accelerated by a boost of foreign investments of over $35 billion. And since 2016, we've actually already begun seeing exports out of Mexico increasing by 6.3% year over year. So this boom has already begun. Very important to discuss this topic, to give you some more insights on really the reasons why and the benefits that you could potentially see from this shift as well. So let's dive into the current situation. Really, why are companies nearshoring? What we saw previously was trends actually shifting manufacturing out of the United States to capture costs in overseas manufacturing and reducing those costs, reducing labor fees as well. Year over year trend since 2016, we've actually seen a shift back towards manufacturing shifting closer to home. And we're seeing the need for expanding, relocating, and really diversifying your manufacturing. This was definitely accelerated through global supply chain disruptions, most notably during COVID. We experienced plants being shut down, production being delayed or slowed due to illness or precautions from the COVID virus. We also saw a decrease in capacity for very similar reasons, less capacity on the road with the plant shut down. We saw some supply chain disruptions and the need for diversification. We also saw a large increase of congestion at the ports, most notably in Long Beach, California. As a result of those plant shutdowns in Asia Pacific region, we saw an influx of containers to Long Beach mixed with a decrease in labor and also capacity, which led to those ports being backed up for months at a time and our containers actually being stuck waiting to be unloaded on the steamships. So really we look at why Mexico and Canada. We have to start with their geographical position. Looking at the close proximity of Canada and Mexico to the United States, right off the bat, we see a much more competitive transit time, where it could take up to 30 days to receive a container from Asia Pacific. We're able to bring product into the market from Canada and Mexico all across the United States in less than a week's time. In addition to that, today, even before the boost in nearshoring and investments, Canada and Mexico are already the number 2 and 3 trade partners with the United States. So we already see the manufacturing is in place. We're seeing the investments to continue scaling that manufacturing and the growth. And we also have in alignment the capacity and then the operational knowledge and labor to support an increase in business coming out of Mexico and Canada. As we move on to that, we also have to look at the foreign trade agreements. Most notably between the United States, Mexico, and Canada is the USMCA agreement to take advantage of tariffs, duties, and the trade agreements between the 3 countries and operational efficiencies that creates. In addition to the USMCA, Mexico specifically has a network of 14 trade agreements with over 50 countries. So in addition to manufacturing for the US, their manufacturing also supports 50 additional countries outside the US, including Europe as well. And most notably, one thing we're always looking to do is continue to stay competitive. With inflation, with expenses being at top of mind, we're always looking for more ways to continue managing our costs, managing our expenses, and staying competitive with the market. One case study we were able to run by shifting manufacturing from overseas to Mexico, we were able to reduce fulfillment or labor costs by 76%, fulfillment costs by 53%, and the tariffs on the goods by 82%. So with that in mind, I want to take a deeper dive into some of the actual benefits that we're seeing and that you could potentially also experience by shifting manufacturing from overseas to Mexico or Canada. So as we know, with that case study, we were able to see the cost and the lead time for any support in the US market. In addition to that, we've also experienced very competitive advantages to our European markets as well. Starting with transit times, the ocean transit time from Mexico to Europe is actually more competitive than our Asia Pacific partners. On average, 16 days from Mexico to Europe, whereas from China to Europe, we experience about 32 days. So some advantages in the lead time and also with the rates as well. This year already, Mexico to Europe ocean rates have been on average about 10 to 25% cheaper than coming out of Asia Pacific. So with the lead time and costs, we're able to see some savings on the ocean side. In addition to that, we're also seeing some cost savings from air shipments as well. Mexico to Europe currently is about 12% cheaper compared to China shipping via air. So not only supporting close proximity to the US market, we're also seeing those advantages for anybody manufacturing and having product being shipped over to European markets as well. It does also support reducing carbon footprint. So any sort of initiatives, this would also contribute to supporting those initiatives and the growth in that footprint as well. Most importantly, we also have improved customer service, what we're seeing. The closer proximity can lead to improved quality control and more hands-on employee training. less travel time, closer proximity, and more time that you're able to spend with your manufacturer, with your employees, and having that opportunity to build the relationships and actually drive the expectations that you're needing. We also have more of a time zone alignment, knowing that Asia Pacific is multiple time zones from North America in general. Taking advantage of those time zones just from East Coast to West Coast is also able to have a little bit better alignment and more stability there as well. Looking then specifically at Mexico and US regulations, we're also able to improve that customer service as well, just having that familiarity in terms of what is needed for customs clearance. Tim will get into some more of those details here in a few minutes, but having that compliance and customs clearance understanding will also lead to efficiencies in your supply chain, but also compliance with the regulations and less risk for fines or any other situations you can encounter there. More alignment with the documents that are needed. It is not a clean process ultimately to ship across the border. There are a set of documents that you will need. Having that knowledge and understanding will improve your lead times and your expenses as well. Familiarity with documents such as the complemento cartaporte, a DOTA, a pedimento, knowing the insides of that will increase your customer experience at the end of the day. And last but not least, security practices. We have a full alignment with CTPAT coming out of Mexico and Canada to be able to bring the best practices for securing your goods and having guidelines to do so as well. We also experience alignment in tech platforms, not needing to use multiple systems to combine ocean, air. We're able to utilize tech platforms specifically built for cross-border and North America as well. And then last but not least, we also want to look at the trade relations. That closer proximity between your manufacturer, your end receiver, your transportation providers, that close proximity, you're able to have more in-person, face-to-face interactions and continue building those relations for long-term success and long-term alignment. And then also an understanding of the local markets and really the culture. There are different languages, there are different cultures, but that close proximity is able to really bridge that gap and bring those cultures and that understanding together. And finally, as discussed, really reduce in labor costs. We had the case study. We've also seen the cost savings that you could get by shipping not only to the US, but also to Europe, limiting those expenses. But we've also seen a trend where manufacturing labor costs in China have actually exceeded those labor costs in Mexico. So being able to take advantage of that, focusing on your expenses, trying to balance that with inflation that we're all experiencing today is also another benefit that you could potentially capture by following this trend. So really, what are companies doing? What are other providers doing? We break this down into two sections. So for nearshoring as a whole, we know that it's ultimately the relocation of your entire production line from overseas or in the US into a foreign country, either Mexico or Canada in this example. That entire production line then supports your inventories and the business you're doing in the United States or overseas markets such as Europe. Another opportunity that we're seeing as well that we classify is near sourcing. So instead of actually shifting an entire production line overseas, we're just going to be continuing that production overseas, but utilizing Mexico for our fulfillment. Instead of managing our inventories and our fulfillment in the US, we're going to shift that over the border into cities such as Tijuana. From there, we're going to manage that inventory and then distribute to the US market once that product is needed, whether it's in a full truckload to a DC or actually through UPS services such as a small package where we're delivering smaller shipments and being able to capture savings from various trade agreements and also utilizing the Section 321 to take advantage of those smaller shipments and the de minimis under $800. With that, I want to pass it over to Tim to talk a little bit more on the brokerage and trade compliance considerations.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. Great overview. And as Alex said, thank you to everyone today for your time and attention. We sincerely appreciate you joining us today. As Alex mentioned, there are some key considerations and benefits that we want to be mindful of when we're thinking of whether we're going to nearshore or near source. My role today is to provide an overview of the customs compliance and the regulatory concerns or considerations that would accompany this business model. So I really want to focus on 5 things. I want to talk about where some of the best options are to nearshore, and Alex mentioned Canada and Mexico. talk about the potential to leverage USMCA or CUSMA or TMEC to lower your duty impact on goods entering the US from one of these nearshore countries. Talk about the ability to leverage Section 321 to reduce potential duty impact for your imports into the US. I also want to talk about forced labor. Forced labor is such a hot topic right now. So I want to touch on that and how that may or may not impact your nearshoring considerations. And then really just talk about some recommended compliance best practices. So, really boiling it down. So next slide, please, Grace. So Alex touched on Mexico and Canada, and I'm going to reiterate some of those same things. Mexico slipped past Canada earlier this year to become the U.S.'s largest North American trading partner. That's the first time that's happened in many, many years. So when you look at Mexico's imports to the U.S., at 78% of their total exports coming into the U.S., and another 13% of their total exports going to Canada, 91% of Mexico's total exports are destined for the US and Canada. They're staying in the North American marketplace. Clearly, there's a manufacturing, a distribution, and a logistics infrastructure that can support nearshoring. Canada, as the second largest North American trading partner, 77% of Canada's exports are destined to the US. Nearly $2 billion per day crosses the US northern border. So Canada benefits from that same proximity, our next door neighbors. Nearly 80% of Canada's population, manufacturing, and distribution is within 100 miles of the US border. So distribution, manufacturing, infrastructure, that proximity really lends itself towards Canada acting as a nearshoring source. Something else to keep in mind, coming into force in 2017, the CETA, the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement between the EU and Canada, effectively eliminated 99% of all duties for EU goods entering Canada. So if you're bringing goods in from the EU into the US and you wanted to bring those into Canada first, do the distribution from Canada, you could potentially bypass some significant duties by bringing those goods into Canada first. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more detail in just a second. At the end of the day, there's a tremendous trade corridor, obviously, between Mexico, US, and Canada. So infrastructure is there, opportunity is there. Two great countries where nearshoring would be very, very effective. That lends itself, again, potential duty savings. If you're bringing ocean freight in, it would potentially eliminate the harbor maintenance fees importing into Canada or Mexico, as opposed to bringing those containers into the US. Obviously, there's merchandise processing fee reductions similarly by importing into Canada or into Mexico as opposed to the US. So next slide, please, Brace. So talking about USMCA, can a company in the US leverage the benefits of USMCA by nearshoring? Potentially, yes. The short answer is yes. And that really boils down to the fact that, can foreign origin goods qualify under USMCA? And the short answer to that is yes, maybe. And it depends on a couple of things, and I'm going to detail those in the next few slides. From a compliance perspective, we're probably familiar with tariff shift and regional value content. So goods entering a country could potentially be subject or potentially receive preferential tariff treatment under USMCA if there's a tariff shift. And a tariff shift basically means the item has undergone a substantial transformation where the origin harmonized tariff classification coming into Mexico, coming into Canada has now been changed. It's been incorporated into something else. It's fundamentally changed its basic nature. It's now something else, a different tariff classification that may potentially qualify under USMCA because it's now considered made in Canada, made in Mexico. Bringing raw materials in, bringing components in and incorporating them may result in a tariff shift. Regional value content is a different take on that. It looks at the finished good, and it says as long as a certain percentage, a minimal percentage of the value of the finished good is North American in origin, it potentially would qualify under USMCA. So these don't apply to all commodities. They don't apply across the board to every single item, but these are options if you're taking the time to understand your products, looking at tariff shift, transforming raw materials or components, or incorporating raw materials and components from a regional value content, you may be able to benefit from relief of tariff on goods because they would be considered North American in origin. Next slide, please, Brace. This is one that gets a lot of play. The Section 321. Can you leverage Section 321 if you nearshore? You might be able to, yeah. So I'm going to delve into this. I don't generally like to put a lot of words on a slide, but I think this is very important, and it opens up a lot of doors for companies to consider nearshoring or near sourcing. So Section 321, we're probably all familiar. Well, it was a way to allow low-value, non-regulated goods to enter the commerce of the United States. Up until 2015, it was $200 in 2015 under the Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act. That was raised to $800. But basically, goods that are free of duty, if you could click down one more here, Brace, to get the bottom here. If they're goods that are not subject to partner government agencies, can claim 321, low value, under $800, coming in off the manifest, no informal or formal entry required. They would enter the US free of duty. So if they've been imported into Canada, they've been imported into Mexico, and now those are coming in an e-commerce mode, they're coming small parcel, they're coming as individual shipments under $800 value, those would be free of duty under Section 321. I do want to point out that some partner government agency goods, so some goods that are regulated, can still come in under Section 321 via what's known as entry type 86. So there are some additional data elements that are required that do need to be provided to the customs broker, but as long as those data elements are there and the value of the goods is under $800, those regulated shipments can still enter the US commerce under Section 321. So again, great opportunity for low value shipments in a e-commerce environment to cross the border and be free of duty, regardless of their origin in the world. If they're entering from Canada, entering from Mexico, they're going to be free of duty. The second party here I want to call out, if we go to the next slide, another consideration, another restriction, it's limited to one import per person per day and a fair retail value of under $800. So again, Brace just touched the bottom there. When I say the fair retail value, it can't be a nominal value. It can't be a made up value. It has to be based upon the purposes of calculating customs duties. So a sample that has no value does not exist. Everything has a value. It has to represent the fair value of the goods to one importer on one single day, value under $800. It's going to come in duty free. The last thing I really want to point out here is the fact that multiple or larger shipments cannot be split into multiple smaller shipments with the intent of allowing these to enter on a duty-free basis. So intentionally splitting a shipment, you've got a $500 shipment, and instead of a $5,000 shipment, instead of making one $5,000 shipment that's subject to duty coming into the U.S. requires a formal entry, breaking that up into 6 smaller shipments that are now all under $800 and thinking, okay, we're going to send them all as small individual shipments to get the value of Section 321. That is illegal. You cannot do that. So you need to be mindful of that. You need to be mindful of the provisions of Section 321. Under $800 fair market value, one importer per day, cannot be a multi-piece shipment that's been split up to make sure that the values come in under $800. When you can do this, you can take advantage of Section 321. Next slide, please. So key takeaways: understand your products are commodities, okay? Make sure that you know the value of the goods, you know what they are, if they're regulated, because if they are regulated, they still may qualify under Section 321. You just need to make sure that they do, because not all regulated shipments will qualify. Anything subject to anti-dumping, countervailing duty does not qualify under Section 321. Alcohol, tobacco do not qualify under Section 321. So know your products, know your commodities. They're qualified, they're below the value, they're going to enter duty-free. It's a simplified entry process. There's no informal entry, there's no formal entry. The shipments are cleared off of a manifest, is what it's called. The carrier typically presents that to customs. Customs approves it. The goods are injected into the domestic network in the U.S. for delivery, typically by your favorite brown trucks, but those are going to go out for delivery. It's a simplified entry process. I will tell you one more benefit. Goods properly entered under Section 321 are not subject to Section 301 duties. we all felt the impact of Section 301 in the late teens. Today, Section 301 duties being applied to goods predominantly from China can raise the duty rate from 10 to 25%. Section 321 allows goods subject to Section 301 to enter the country free of duty. Another great reason, bring goods into Canada, bring them into Mexico, bring them into the US via Section 321. You could potentially bypass those 301 duties. As Alex pointed out, increased speed to market, increased customer satisfaction. You've reduced your costs. You've made it an easy transaction for an e-commerce buyer, and the goods are going to deliver quickly. Your customers are going to be very, very happy. Next slide, please. One of the other key considerations, I mentioned it earlier, this is a hot topic, forced labor. Do forced labor provisions apply? Yeah, I hate to tell you, the bottom line is they do. So at the end of the day, it's the importer's responsibility to make sure that they understand their supply chain and they're aware of whether or not their goods are going to be subject to forced labor provisions. We've heard all about the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. That's the big one right now. There are 52 different withhold release orders that are currently in place. And as you can see highlighted on the screen, from last October to this March, 182 days, there were 2,293 entries that were stopped for forced labor enforcement actions or reviews. That's 13 a day. It is a hot topic. Goods are going to be looked at. The importer needs to know where their goods are originating, if they touched forced labor, if they're impacted by forced labor, and they need to make sure that they are not, because it is the importer's responsibility to monitor that. It's also the importer's responsibility to prove that they are not subject to those provisions. So if the goods get into the country and the shipper over in China, for instance, says, well, these aren't subject to that, that's not good enough. It's on you as the importer to be able to substantiate the fact that the goods are not subject to forced labor provisions. Nearshoring, at the end of the day, or near sourcing, does not mitigate or eliminate the forced labor provisions, the forced labor requirements that you as an importer may have to understand your supply chain. So again, nearshoring is great for a few different things. It does not mitigate those forced labor requirements. So bringing this all home on the next slide, I would share with a customer looking at nearshoring or near sourcing the same best practices I would share with any customer when it comes to customs compliance. It all starts with and revolves around due diligence. We heard of, we all know the MOD Act, the Customs Modernization Act, and due diligence and reasonable care were the standard. Do your due diligence, know your products, know your commodities, and understand the associated import and export requirements. Now you've got a third country involved. You're importing from China to Mexico to the US, Germany to Canada to the US. Understand that there are different import requirements in different countries. If you bring cosmetics in from Germany into Canada, Health Canada review is going to come into play. The fact that they're FDA approved here in the United States has no bearing in Canada. FDA holds no sway. So understand that when you're dealing with a third country, you've got that country's import requirements and export requirements that you need to be mindful of. Product database, and that really goes to that point. Make sure that you've got a complete product database with the tariff classifications for all countries involved. Again, Canada, Mexico, US, China. Understand those HS10 at each individual country level, because there may be different requirements. There are certainly different statistical and tariff digits that come into play there from 6 through 10. So make sure that you have a complete product dictionary for each country in which you're importing. Know your rules of origin. We talked about tariff shift. We talked about regional value content. If you're bringing in commodities, you're bringing in parts, you're bringing in components, you're bringing in raw materials, and those are going to be transformed in some way or assembled in some way. Understand what rules of origin are applicable, and you may be able to, as I mentioned earlier, leverage the benefits of USMCA by virtue of the fact that you've transformed or met the RVC component requirements. So understand your rules of origin. Valuation is a key. I mentioned it under Section 321. Valuation requirements are established throughout the world. The World Customs Organization establishes that hierarchy for valuation. Each country follows it in its own different ways, but know your valuation. Different countries have statistical deductions or standardized deductions or standardized additions that come into play. Make sure that you understand what those are if you're importing into Mexico, importing into Canada. So your valuation is appropriate at import into that country, as well as upon import into the US. Record keeping is a key, right? Every country has its record keeping obligations that customs in that country will establish. So Mexico and the US have similar 5-year requirements for record keeping for imports and exports. Canada has 6 years plus the current year. Make sure you understand what your record keeping obligations are so that you're keeping track of everything that comes in, that you're bringing into that country, as well as everything that you're exporting out of that country. You need to be able to trace goods moving from end to end. The other advantage that comes along with that, when you import goods into Mexico, typically VAT is applicable. When you import them into Canada, GST would be applicable. If you subsequently export those goods back out of that country, you may be able to recover the VAT or the GST, as well as the duty via a duty drawback program, but you need to make sure you're keeping track of accurate records for your imports, for your exports. Record keeping is key. And the last one is really having a strong partnership. I cannot stress this enough. Your customs broker is your agent. They are your advocate. They are working on your behalf in the countries in which you are importing and exporting. Make sure you're working with a reliable customs broker that has the size and the scope and the coverage to address these requirements in multiple countries, because again, you need to track from source to destination, imports and exports. Make sure your partnerships are solid. Solid customs broker, utilize carriers that have the size and the scope and the coverage to support. They have the systems in place, especially if you're utilizing 321, because they're going to be entering those goods off their manifest at time of clearance. Make sure they're multimodal. They can handle your small package. They can handle your air freight, your ocean freight. Make sure your partners are there and they're able to support your nearshoring activities, regardless of what countries they are in. So again, I leave my final point on compliance. In the same way that you're diligent and you show reasonable care here in the US, that same due diligence and reasonable care is going to apply when you nearshore or when you near source. So thank you again for your time and attention today. I'm going to turn it back over to Alex now to finish our presentation.
Thank you, Tim. Next slide, please. Great. So now we've of nearshoring, the benefits, some of the more actual finer points for the brokerage process. Also want to look at what the future outlook looks like, and also some considerations and some items to be aware of. Very first question we get often is, do I still need to source from APAC? And quite simply, the answer is each supply chain is very unique in its own right. Whether you need multiple sources of manufacturing depends on really the size of your supply chain and really what your needs are. So short answer is potentially. Not one size fits all when it comes to nearshoring and the solution that we need. So it's important to learn from some of the teachings during COVID. If we had any type of struggles and challenges sourcing product, meeting inventory levels, meeting customer expectations, there's probably a potential that you might need to diversify and continue sourcing out of Mexico, Asia Pacific as well. But ultimately, each supply chain is unique and it should be evaluated as its own solution each time. Another question we see often is on the port congestion and capacity. These are constraints that we see every once in a while. There's a lot of volatility in the market as production influxes go throughout the year. Capacity also has ups and downs. There's a potential for there to be congestion again, and having the backup option or primary option sourcing out of Mexico or Canada could also support in avoiding these type of congestions again in the future. And there's always the opportunity for some sort of labor strike that could also create port congestion or capacity constraints as well. And last but not least, one thing to really consider is the trade compliance environment. Changes in administration could also lead to changes in policies. That could be on trade agreements. We recently saw NAFTA be updated into USMCA. That was very fortunate for manufacturing out of Mexico and Canada. But if any type of policy changes could go in a different direction, that's something to be very aware of, as it could also affect your business as well. And ultimately, what the tariffs that you could potentially be paying. We're seeing a lot of opportunities for cost saving and tariffs today. But if there are any type of policy changes, that could also change in the future as well. And last one is the de minimis. Currently, it sits at $800. Anything $800 or less fits under the de minimis and be able to capture those savings. If the de minimis is eliminated or reduced, that could ultimately affect the savings that we're experiencing today. And just something to be taken into consideration and be aware of. While all the benefits sound great, there are potentially some curveballs and challenges that could be experienced, and it's just good to be aware of as you're evaluating what is best for your supply chain. Next slide, please. So really, as we wrap this up, want to summarize some of the key takeaways, and most importantly, we want to evaluate, is nearshoring for you? And similar to the last slide, it ultimately depends on each individual supply chain and what the needs are. When we look at evaluating our supply chains, really important to know the size of it. Are we able to source all of our product and manufacturing out of one location, being Mexico, Canada, somewhere closer to home? Or are we going to need to diversify and have multiple locations to support multiple markets? The location of those suppliers is very important as well, as it needs to take into account the proximity to our end receivers, taking into account cost, lead times, really what our needs are to be able to best hit and fit those needs. And really the product, what are we shipping? Is there an opportunity for duty and tax savings, or is there not? Something that needs to be evaluated as we're looking at the entire nearshoring picture holistically and what that means for you and your company. And then transportation costs as well. Over the road differs from ocean and air, and taking into account all the different products that we would be utilizing to transport your goods, and ultimately what is your final cost on that, and the cost savings that you could be experiencing. Some challenges we could face: there's a language barrier. Mexico primarily speaking Spanish, US English, Canada English, and then parts French as well. So some language barriers that could potentially overcome, and important to have staffing within your company to be able to support that and have proper communication to level set and align on expectations. There are the cultural differences. Close proximity could definitely help eliminate and bridge that barrier, but also something to take in consideration. And also the need for additional infrastructure, as nearshoring continues to be a hot trend and companies continue to transition manufacturing from overseas to Mexico or Canada. There's also going to be the need to increase that infrastructure. There are many industrial parks today in Mexico with additional space to take on more manufacturing, bring in new companies. And as we saw, there is that boost in the foreign investments of that money flowing into supporting that infrastructure. But it could also be a challenge as well, and something that needs to be considered. Where are we going to ultimately set up shop and move our supply chain from overseas closer to home, and what is the infrastructure today and potential barriers in the future?
Well, Tim and Alex, thank you so much for taking the time to share those valuable insights with us today. We appreciate your expertise and leadership. So now we're getting into the Q&A section, and I see that a number of people have been using the Q&A feature at the bottom down there. Some people have been using the chat, and I know that we have some folks on the back side. We have Anna, Kelly, and Jeff, Tim, and Alex that are participating and answering some of your chat questions back there. But we did have some questions that we wanted to answer live. So I believe this one is for Alex. Most of the customers are in the US and in Europe. It's clear how much faster and cheaper distribution would be from Mexico to US versus origins in Asia. But can a Mexican manufacturing operation support Europe as well? How would the logistics compare to traditional supply chains serving Asia, Europe? And do you see that costs could rise if nearshoring becomes more popular?
Excellent question. I saw Ryan sent that over to us as well. So excellent question. Definitely the short answer is it's favorable. It may not be really the first thing that comes to mind when thinking about shifting manufacturing operations to Mexico. First and foremost, we always think of supporting the close market in the US, but Mexico to Europe trade lanes are generally faster and what we've seen recently less expensive than origins from Asia Pacific. Ocean specifically, Mexico to Europe, we mentioned it earlier, is about 16 days of transit time versus China to Europe coming in around 32 days. So around a month, about half the transit time. In 2023 so far, ocean full container loads have been about 10 to 25% cheaper as well. So in addition to that reduced transit time, we are also seeing those cost savings and a similar trend for international air freight as well. The transit time won't be too different, but ultimately what we are seeing is about 10% cheaper on the rate side of things. So getting a similar transit time, but being able to capture some of those cost savings by utilizing that manufacturing in Mexico to support your European market as well. And there are those free trade agreements that are already in place. So that trade lane is supported by those agreements, and something that with those agreements in place, expect that it could expand over time as well. Looking at what the costs could be, we know what the costs are today. Ultimately, on that trade lane, there could potentially be volatility just based on supply and demand. But as the supply continues to keep up with the demand, we would expect the cost to stay relatively competitive to the other markets as well, to be able to continue capturing those cost savings in addition to the lead time and transit savings as well.
Awesome. Thank you. Oh, we're getting more Q&A in there. I love it. Love it. Now, I'm not saying we're going to get to all of them, but some of them we're going to try and do live here. But if we cannot, we're going to try and answer them privately. And hopefully you left your name so that we can get in contact with you if need be. I have another one for Tim. You talked about the tariff shift and regional value content as means by which goods not manufactured in North America might possibly be duty-free when crossing borders. Can you provide an explanation of these two terms so that I know if my products qualify?
Yeah, thanks, Bruce. Good question. I'm going to use my favorite analogy when it comes to tariff shift and regional value content to make it easy. So, and I'll use this from the perspective of somebody in the US bringing product in, but the same provisions would apply for Mexico or Canada in this case. If you bring vanilla in from Malaysia, and you bring chocolate in from Switzerland, you bring sugar in from Jamaica, flour in from Brazil, and you mix them all up in a bowl here in the US with a couple of eggs, and you bake those and turn them into chocolate chip cookies, that would be a tariff shift. You've got individual items that each have a very distinct HS10, a very distinct tariff classification coming into the US. That tariff, that product is being substantially transformed into something else. Those chocolate chip cookies, even though they're almost exclusively made of foreign content, can now be considered to be made in the USA and would benefit from USMCA. That's tariff shift. Thinking along those same lines, if you look at the value of the finished good, if that chocolate chip cookie is $5, which means I probably bought it at Starbucks or something, it's a $5 chocolate chip cookie, and 50 cents is the chocolate from Switzerland, and 20 cents is the vanilla from Malaysia, the eggs, flour, et cetera. When you add that all together and you take a look at the value of the finished good, including US labor, US components, if at least 50 or 60% of the value is US in origin, and there are two different thresholds based upon the formula that is used. There are two applicable formulas. You have to use one or the other. If the value of the North American content is at least 50 or 60%, depending on your formula, that chocolate chip cookie could still be considered to be made in the USA, even though, again, you've brought in components from different countries around the world. So that's the easiest way that I can explain tariff shift and regional value content. Again, tariff shift, you're substantially transforming everything. Regional value content, at least X% needs to be North American in origin. So I hope that answers the question.
Well, it's answering the question of lunchtime for me. I like cookies. So if I'm in Mexico or Canada, can I just eat the cookie there? That'd be great. All right. Let's see. I have I believe you may have answers, but let me just throw it out there anyway. Can I leverage Section 321 to reduce duty or tax?
Potentially. Again, so as I mentioned earlier, if your goods are accurately valued under $800 and they're coming in, cleared off the manifest, the carrier's bringing them in from Mexico, from Canada, from any country for that matter, if they're under $800 and accurately valued, single importer, single day, single PO, then the duty would be eliminated for most commodities. Keeping in mind, there are some regulated commodities. If the commodities are regulated, they might be eligible to be duty-free if they qualify under entry type 86. But there are some commodities, alcohol, tobacco, goods that are subject to anti-dumping or countervailing duty that would never be applicable for 321.
Awesome. All right, we're still getting some questions through our Q&A feature. So I'm going to pull a couple of those out there. And I know that we're answering some of them back behind the scenes. Let me go with, if we move fulfillment DC to Mexico and ship orders to the US, will it use international rate or domestic rate?
I'm going to leave that to Alex, the transportation guy.
Yeah, ultimately, I think it would depend if we're talking brokerage or transportation. On the transportation side, it would be ultimately dependent on the origin of where that shipment would originate from. Using an example, if we're going to be shifting our fulfillment or production to Tijuana, the origin and our pickup would be in Tijuana, so we'd be using an international capacity and therefore an international rate to move the product to the end receiver.
Awesome. And let me see, there's another one here. Let me pull this one out. I love going into the Answer Live. Would nearshoring increase efficiency and TNT for reverse logistics?
I could take that one too, Tim. And the answer would be yes. The transit times do work in both directions, whether we're exporting goods out of Mexico to the United States with a certain transit time. The same transit time is observed if we're importing product from the United States to Mexico as well. Or same thing for Canada, north of the border.
What are some of the best options to nearshore?
I think we touched on that. Canada, Mexico are the two obvious ones, right? They're our next door neighbors. So we've got educated workforces, we've got infrastructure, distribution, manufacturing. Either of those two countries are certainly very well positioned to be effective nearshoring or near sourcing. Transportation cost is going to be the lowest. You can keep everything on the surface as opposed to air freight or ocean freight. So those are the two most obvious choices. But there are certainly other countries in the world that would be applicable for nearshoring. I can't speak to what those are right off the top of my head, but we could certainly get back to you with some other suggestions based upon what our customers are telling us.
Awesome. And I'm not sure, I know it was a question that came in, but I'm not sure if you actually answered it, but I don't know if everybody saw the answer, but I wanted to bring it up as well. This is a question for you, Tim, but I think you responded to it. It's, can you speak to the use of the FTZs in the immediate future as it pertains to nearshoring? Do you see more businesses moving towards the use of FTZs given the current trade climate?
Yeah, absolutely. Foreign trade zones have a tremendous value in the supply chain right now. A lot of that depends upon what you need them for. So if you are bringing in multiple shipments coming in all at once, you have the option of utilizing what's known as a gateway FTZ solution, where you bring in multiple shipments, they're cleared through the FTZ. You do a weekly entry summary for customs. So there's one single customs entry at the week. That's going to minimize the MPF cost, because instead of having multiple individual shipments subject to MPF, now you've got a single shipment subject to MPF. You've got an individual customs entry. Simplifies record keeping from a compliance perspective, minimizes cost. We've got a lot of customers that are utilizing the Gateway FTZ solution. There's also benefit in duty deferral. So if you're bringing product in and it doesn't need to be entered into the commerce of the US right away, you can park that, so to speak, in an FTZ where it waits until you need to do fulfillment or distribution. When those goods are removed from the FTZ, only then is duty going to be applied to those goods. So you've got the ability to bring in a large container of shipment or containers, put them in an FTZ so that you're warehousing them domestically, and then you're only paying duty as necessary when the goods are ultimately sold. So there's a couple of different benefits when utilizing an FTZ, but we're seeing an increasing request for that. We do have a division called Zone Solutions that can certainly help with that. Again, please reach out to us afterwards and we can put you in touch with the right folks from Zone Solutions to further vet that out for you and see if it's the right solution.
That's awesome. Well, I am going to probably stop all the Q&A. I think we're getting to the end of our webinar at the moment. Again, thank you all so much for your insights, Alex and Tim. I want to thank all the attendees for participating. And I want to also remind you that it is being recorded and that we're going to send the recording to everybody who did register for the webinar. But I also want to remind you, once you close out of this, you're going to get a message about a survey. And please fill out the survey. And if you want someone to contact you, please leave your information so that we can have someone actually contact you as well. But thank you all so much and have an excellent day.